Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Inspire Health podcast. And today we are continuing on with our illusion of free choice, a return to mastering your own life. And today we've got Darren Austin Hall. And Darren was a guest of mine back in episode 30. So now we are closer to episode 160.
What
So
was that? Like 3 years ago?
yeah,
Was
well,
that
I
3 years
think
ago?
Darren, we talked to you literally back. It was right when COVID had
Oh,
kind of
right.
started because we were doing a series
Uh-huh.
kind of around the idea of it was right when there was this pause, right? Where everybody was kind of
Right.
put back in and no one was doing everything. And we were just talking about that a little bit before we kicked things off here. But yeah, I had a really wonderful chat with Darren back then and wanted to bring him back to get his insights on this concept of free choice and just what it means. Are we living in this world of free choice? What does free choice even mean? What does it mean when we talk about a return to mastering your own life? Aren't we the masters of our own life? What does that even mean? So I really appreciate the wisdom that Darren brings. Darren's a sound healer. He's a mystic musician, a song channel. He's a spiritual teacher, philosopher. He's created all sorts of different things. I'll put a list of those. We'll talk about those kind of at the end, I think, we'll bring awareness to those. And I'll put his full bio in the beginning here. But Darren's got such a fascinating, diverse experience. And it's part of what I really like about talking to different people for this series is you get people that have had such diverse experiences. And I want their perspectives. And I also think they're really critical thinkers. Like I think they can see outside of the standard box. And I like to hear, because I think every time people get a chance to hear a slightly different perspective, or sometimes a big different perspective, it just gets them to relook at their own life from a new lens. So I think we had talked even after we did our first interview, Darren. We were talking about this, actually doing this series, because you had said that you had a background prior to getting into sound healing and musician and all this sort of work. You were doing more media info and technology at Western University. So Darren, welcome to the show. And I'm just
Great to be
excited to have a
back.
conversation with you about all of this stuff.
I actually attended one of your first healing sessions back at Downward Dog before Marla and Ron had that
Whoa.
studio together.
That's
Like
back
it
Like
in the
was,
day.
was it the self-practice Mysore class on Fridays?
no, it was,
Okay.
you actually held a standalone event at Downward
Oh,
Dog. And
oh,
it was,
cool.
I don't know, it was like 15 years ago or
Jeez.
like it was a long time ago.
It was like more of like a concert, like
It
Sound
was a
Journey.
concert, yeah.
Whoa, I
Yeah.
wonder if there was a very special one that I'll never forget that happened at Downward Dog that really like launched me into a whole new path of musicianship.
Mm.
Could have been that one. Wow. Amazing.
Awesome. So, Darren, when we talk about the idea of free choice and the concept of mastering your own life, I mean, where do you even go with that? From maybe like if we step back and look at your background originally, because you started in media and info technology. I mean, how did that influence the direction you were going or even shifting the direction that you were moving?
Maybe we can even start there. Like, how does media and television actually create our reality for us? Like the subliminal messages that go into creating these images, the light flashing, the addictive nature of screen time for adults and kids especially. What does that exactly mean, and how does that play out within our lives? What kind of impressions do those images create? Maybe we could start there.
Just a real simple question to begin everything with.
Yeah.
I was about to say this is a huge one. This is great. Well, yeah, it's so great to be back with you guys, and like this, these are really profound questions that I think are highly relevant to what's going on in the world right now because there is so many great shifts. I mean, we're in this age of prophecy. It's been prophesized that dark age to light, that there's a huge new, almost like people are calling it the new earth. Some people even believe like there's a new form of consciousness being birthed. And I think this very idea of, the simulated reality that some call the matrix, that the media is so much a proponent of, the creators of, think of television as being like tell a vision, from the get-go, from just being children, we're perpetually plugged in to this reality that is very much shaped and socially engineered. And with the internet, with the advent of the internet, I think that's all been stepped up massively. And I think the pandemic has been a huge point of just exposing a lot of this complex to the point where I think a lot of people are aware that the fact checkers are not exactly fact checkers, that the amount of censorship on social media, it's like we all got opted into this system that seemed kind of innocuous. And then all of a sudden there's like all these massive, distorted, oppressive censorships happening, where like our very belief systems are being weaponized and very like narrowed. Um, and so I think in terms of free will, when I was studying media information technoculture at university, it definitely made me aware, yeah, of just how dangerous this reality is for a human being with consciousness. Because when do we actually have moments when we do things for ourselves or think for ourselves? Think back to the ancient Greeks and Socrates going around and getting everyone to question their own beliefs. I think a lot of us are going through that moment collectively right now. And that's why a lot of my work now has been veering into eco spirituality and getting people back to nature, because I almost feel that there is this collective knowing, like, whoa, the consciousness that's behind all of these decisions we're making in terms of like evolving our technology, resetting our civilization so massively, it's distorted. There's something wrong there, and we haven't gone back to really correct or heal that. Some of us are breaking away though and are choosing to go and do that healing work massively. And I've been discovering that when you go out into nature and you spend a lot more time in nature, you do come to that process of what we were just talking about before we started, about being. And I'm so fascinated by this beingness, because when you sit and allow yourself to be, it reminds me of what the Taoists said, their precept is wu wei, which is not doing. But of course, when you don't do anything, you realize there's something else already just doing, and it's nature. Whether we call it internally our homeostasis, that's always healing ourselves. But I would say homeostasis also works on the level of consciousness, such as when I sit in nature and just meditate or be, insights come to me, some of the most revelacious insights that a book or even a teacher couldn't give me. And that's something that I'm deeply inquiring of right now. And I think it's very important for us to really get more into ourselves and into realizing that this matrix isn't necessarily have our best interests in mind. Sorry, that was a very Gemini answer all over the place. I'm Gemini sun, so guilty.
Well, it also, when you were talking about even just being, and I mean, we're big proponents too on the concept of nature. I actually think that is what I think will kind of be a uniting factor for most people. I think things have to kind of tie back to more of what a natural law kind of looks like, both not just nature, like the trees and the waters and stuff, but what that even means within ourselves internally. I think this is all sort of coming out, and we're going to see what that actually feels like. But being in nature in its own, like when you can actually get out in the trees and sit for a while. I mentioned this before, but it was like, I remember a patient of mine that had been off of all media for a while and was outside lots and getting outdoors all the time. And she got back after a few months and turned her media on, and she'd said to turn it off. She goes that she actually made her feel physically kind of ill, and she felt like she was being manipulated. That was just her words from having no exposure to then having exposure to it. So why I think that's important is because like that's what you actually find when you go through a detox. Like if we do a detox, people actually go through a bit of a withdrawal sometimes initially, but then when they actually bring a really irritating food or something back into their world, once they've taken it out and they've got a new set, a baseline for what normality is in their body or what optimal is in their body, then they bring that food back. They get a very strong reaction to it, usually initially, because it's something that does not resonate with them. I feel like that's the same for any of this stuff. But sometimes it makes me think like, we're making our choices based on a certain idea of what normal is within our body, but we don't even know what optimal could be.
Yeah, and when you look at a lot of spirituality, and I'm talking more like traditional tantric, yogic, ancient mystery school stuff, the spiritual path has a huge, intense period of initiation where it is about disidentifying with your egoic conditioning. And that can literally throw someone into almost like an initiated form of insanity, which you could call the dark night of the soul, because there's this understanding in a lot of spiritual cultures that most people grow up in a normal society And that society has its function. It's not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but we're conditioned from the moment we're born to be something. And that something is generally not coming from an inner revelation. It's coming from all these things, projecting them onto themselves as education, the conditioning of our parental units, and even you could venture our ancestral karmas. But in spirituality, there's this kind of movement where you should be stripping away, and a good guru or a good teacher will be guiding you into this like very radical, and it can be a quite vulnerable period of confronting your beliefs, denuding your psychology to really figure out, well, what does it really mean to be a human being? What does it mean to have a soul? These things are great mysteries, and we walk around as if we're in the secure world. But, you know, and that's why when some people do psychedelics, especially people who have had not much awakenings in their life, can be quite harrowing at first because they're all of a sudden like, oh my God, like this whole story of existence and stuff just like falls away. And I realize I haven't come up with any of this on my own. And I'm on like very shaky ground in that sense. But then there's this process of building it back up, you know, and that's about like really trying to figure truth out for yourself, which is this what the ancients called gnosis, the path of self-realization, they call it in yoga. And I do feel in our modern age that this is huge point of what we call sovereignty. You know, I think most people are waking up to the fact now that we are ruled by this authority of whether we want to call them elite politicians, or, you know, if you want to step further and say this globalist kind of regime of that's like really founded on very secretive societies. They're making, you know, you look at the World Economic Forum, they're making these grand decisions for us. And people are just like, yes, okay, for sure. And they're just nodding and going along in this consensual sort of agreement to just give their freedom of choice over to this big body, because a lot of them were in a lot of fear because of the pandemic. But then there's a huge part of humanity right now who's saying, like that path is not good. It's not wholesome. It's not healthy. So the other path I'm going to choose is a lot more even scary in a sense. But there's a solidarity because a lot of people are starting to walk that path together. And that path is, why don't we create something new? Why don't we be pioneers? Why don't we hook into that Aquarian age idea, which is about pioneering something new? And by doing so, it's going to require us to now be the story makers, the myth makers. It's up to us to erect this new story of our humanity, which is, to me, incredibly exciting when you enroll people in it in the right way, and it's a constructive path, and there's a real beautiful, mature community that's surrounding these ideas and working together in interdependence. Then there's amazing potentials.
I love the concept of being a pioneer. I think that can sit well with people too, because it can be scary too. It can be super exciting, but at the same point,
You're stepping into
you
the
really are
unknown.
stepping into unknown, and that by nature is going to trigger that sort of fight or flight. And so I think sometimes when the concept of sometimes spirituality, people think it's all just kind of this, kind of enlightened sort of feeling, and it's like, I mean, that's really not. Most of it is the process of just treading your own path, like authentically within yourself,
Well, it
and
involves a breakdown of the ego, what
totally.
we think we know or what we think we are. So as a result, then yes, you are going to get dark night of the soul. You are going to have questions about everything.
Hmm.
You are going to reevaluate everything you have done. And also I wanted to go back to, you mentioned gnosis, and I think the definition of gnosis is so beautiful. So I did want to define it here before we move further. Gnosis is defined as intuitive apprehension of spiritual truths, an esoteric form of knowledge as sought by the Gnostics. Science knowledge, knowledge of the highest kind, specifically mystical knowledge. How is that relevant to navigating our current time right now, Darren?
For me, it's probably one of the most important things because, you know, just to tie this all in full circle, because this is a fairly deep theme that I've been investigating for the past 10 years, is that nature itself, according to the ancient Gnostics, who was not, it wasn't a religion. Gnostic was a title given to someone who had been through this very strenuous process, this very disciplined process of coming to a point where they were able to extract wisdom on their own from nature. And nature was said to be the goddess Sophia, or the wisdom goddess. Sophia actually means wisdom in Latin. And so if you look at a lot of the ancient cultures, even the yogis, they were forest dwelling sages. Even Buddha, when he's having his ultimate test by Mara, the king of the demons, Mara says, well, how do we know that this whole enlightenment thing isn't just your own illusion because you're here alone by yourself? And Buddha touches the ground and says, she is my witness. Well, who is this she? And of course, this she, the goddess, was really removed from our culture with the rise of patriarchy. So to pull this all full circle, to me, what's happening right now on the planet is that there is this kind of awakening of human consciousness, but it's also being initiated by the planet herself. And this is prophesized in a lot of the ancient texts, like the Nag Hammadi library. And a lot of these ancient mystery schools, these spiritual universities, revered this fact that we are living on the body within the soul of this sentient being. And it's fascinating that Western scientists in 1974, James Lovelock, finally brought this back to the fore with Gaia theory, because they start to look at the planet at this point globally with this big macro lens. And they're like, wow, all the ecosystems are working together. The atmosphere is constantly changing to be in sensitive alignment with the sun, which could just like burn us up in any given moment. And when you see all of these systems working together, came clear to this environmental scientist, James Lovelock, that this is like a sentient being. And I love that he used the term Gaia to sort of honor the ancient Greeks who knew this as well. And of course, we see this happening as well with this experience of ayahuasca, for example, because in the mystery schools, they also used a plant medicine called the Kikion, and it was used to interface them with this higher intelligence, which we are within, which we are part of. So to me, gnosis is really relevant now, because I think we are living this prophecy that as these tyrannies of mind control fall away, while it can be scary to a lot of people who have no idea what else to choose, for those of us who are on this spiritual path, it's like we know, oh, well, thank goddess. Now we have time to just meditate and start to self-create, because we're starting to rely on that a lot more. People are starting to step more into their intuitive side, which is their feminine side, right? And this is when the patriarchy starts to wobble and diminish, which it is, and we really have this equilibrium starting again with the masculine and feminine. That's happening in everyone's being. So this idea of always rationally knowing, which is the masculine, which is very good, book smart, these things are very important. But then this feminine side is coming online in all beings, men and women. And it's saying, hey, you have this heart that you can trust. And so many of the ancient teachings talk about the heart being this portal. The Taoist said it's where you discern the wisdom of the guiding realm. And that's an amazing thing when people start to say no to the authority out there and start to realize there's an authority inside of my heart that's the most genius, loving, playful, funny, incredible authority that I've ever known. And that to me is like the beginning of enlightenment, when people start to trust that, because that relationship has a huge form that can take place. And I believe it's an endless expansion, and in some ways, the last thing I'll say is someone who's very spiritual, to me, in the most idyllic form, is someone who is in trust of that, who has detected their own ego enough that they know when to be in clear rapport with that, and they can tell when they're being biased. It's very high level intelligence, actually, and we're just starting to step into this kind of new noetic science of consciousness now. So it's like we're all kind of innocent in this, and that's why we need a lot of playtime, I feel, too. To just like, what does that mean? I've thought about like, if a group of friends got together every Tuesday, we could have like Telepathy Tuesday to just play with these things, because gosh, there's just so much more that we haven't even activated in our consciousness when we're allowed to give ourselves the own authority to just see what else there is to our humanity, rather than just listening to Klaus Schwab.
Yeah, you had spoken of feminine energy, and for listeners who are not really familiar, you did speak on it, but I wonder if you can specifically speak of the qualities that you're speaking of when you say feminine qualities encompassed by the male as well as the female. You're not talking about men becoming pregnant or that sort of thing, are you?
No, no. And it's very interesting because, part of this, and I do, I have my issues with New Age spirituality, but there's no doubt that there's like a new age coming and or that we're in this turning point. And it's almost like truth has become very multidimensional. And one thing I say about a multidimensional world is that many things can be true at the same time. So when we look at, for example, the rise of transgenderism, I mean, there's clearly so many different points of view on this, and like there's concern on one side, there's concern on all sides. Some people are afraid that their children are being indoctrinated in something that's unwholesome, and then I think you have authentic beings who need to be seen and acknowledged. But I think another truth that's happening is that transgenderism is also just pointing to the fact that there is this transgenderness to the human soul. The human soul is like a hermaphrodite at its essential form. And most esoteric forms of spirituality were about this alchemizing of the masculine and feminine so that they could come into harmony within. Now, within that, you're playing with polarity. A lot of heterosexual partners play with that idea, especially because there's such an emphasis on polarity with a masculine feminine body. But I think at the root, there is this now resurgence of trying to understand what is the divinity of the masculine, the divinity of the feminine, outside of all the weird polluted social conditioning. Because clearly, what we've been spoon-fed since like the 1950s when mass media really rolled out are gender roles that don't really feed and nourish a lot of us. And I think that's why gender dysphoria has been for decades such a huge thing in a lot of people's lives, because I think when you get to a certain age, you're like, I don't agree with this, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you go on a path of transitioning. What I do think it means, it could, but I think what it also means is that we're being offered this new exploration of what it means to be masculine and feminine, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. I know for me, the work I do with men, because I do a lot of work with men, was galvanized by me discovering books and workshops about conscious masculinity. And it was only then that I felt comfortable with being a man. Before then, I was very kind of confused. I was what the world was, society was saying was, I need to always be in touch with my feminine. And thus I was like constantly exiling this side of me and to get into more of the distinguishments, this side of me that was like very aggressive, that liked primal physical power, that wanted to attack things in my life, not necessarily with violence, but to go after like a pursuit or a goal. That kind of warrior archetype that's like, just like really gets off on being like loud and proud and doing physical stuff that's very big. And at the same time, when that came online, I felt more kind of safe to be more in touch with the feminine, which is more of that sensuous, embodied. You think of body being more feminine, male is more of the mind, and trusting this intuition. So to just loop it in with the meta theme here, the heart, I would say, is more about that intuitive, emotional knowing about the world that women by nature are more in touch with because of such things as their menstrual cycle, which cleans their blood, which is in Chinese medicine where the soul is rooted. So they have more access to almost this body intelligence. Whereas men have this tendency to go up in their heads and abstract and rationalize, which has its power. But it's interesting that a lot of traditional spiritual cultures say that the heart intelligence is kind of supreme. And this is why, last thing I'll say is in a lot of indigenous societies, it would be the grandmothers who would be like the top of the echelon of all the people in the society. And I think that's saying something, that there is something about that feminine side that is really potent. The patriarchy's like been really freaked out about for a long time.
Well, it's funny, I remember doing a course with Greg Braden. I think he called it the House of Grandmothers. The Council of Grandmothers was literally the last say in things, because they actually held a better perspective of what was actually in the highest good for the whole, for everything.
Yes,
where
exactly.
where it wasn't quite that way from The
the
male.
grandfathers.
Well, I think there's different roles, and I don't really think, a lot of times everybody likes to kind of polarize things and make good and bad. We naturally like to do that, but it really is different. It's no different than yin and yang. They're both beneficial. They need to work together. They've got their different pros and they've got their different things when they're in balance or out of balance. That's all it is. It's
Yes.
trying to merge these two, which I think right now seems to be the time that we are able to unite these two energies in a much more balanced way within ourselves and within the collective. It's like in the Hawaiian shamanism would talk about this when the eagle and the condor fly together. Where it's
Yeah.
been the eagle for so long, which has been more the male energy, how they've
Right.
explained it. And the condor, now they fly together. It's not like they take turns. They're now going to be flying together. So I think that's exactly, and it makes a lot of sense to me when I hear a lot of the stuff that's going on. And it's such a mix with that when you look at all of it, it's like, I see too people that I think are very legitimately trying to balance out what's going on in their body, what they're feeling like. And then I see other people too that I think have been their senses have even been kind of hijacked to what media is telling them. So there's a big mix going on with all of that. To me, it seems like the heart of it, literally, is getting back to that grander sense of who we are and trying to operate from that place. So you've talked about the heart several times as well. And how does one even begin that process then? Because ultimately, I think if we're not really, if the goal in some minds, or the journey is not to arrive at that sort of more and more truthful sense of information that we're tapping into, and I feel like we're just kind of recycling around a lot of beliefs and
Programming.
falsehoods and programs and all of these things. We might step one belief up to maybe a slightly more larger belief, but ultimately we're often still cycling around stuff that the truth of it is not even really real.
Mm.
So if we're wanting to really navigate from that place, to me, that I think about when we have free choice, it's the choice that's coming from the grander sense of who we really are. What's been your process as far as what's required to kind of first connect to that? And then I guess what comes up for us when we actually try to live from that?
Those are great questions. I mean, I think this whole idea of being needs to be extrapolated into people's lives, into practices. And that may sound like an oxymoron, but in a culture that is so centered on the doing, which we are in the West, what has really allowed me to turn the wheel the other way, and it's very cliche, but just things like meditation, and actually living meditation, which was first seeded in me with Eckhart Tolle's books, because what I think Tolle really took, or really evolved, was this idea of, hey, you can be meditating, which is accessing really the present moment in this naked self-awareness at any time. It doesn't have to be just when you're sitting down. Now, that takes a certain amount of discipline. And what I loved about what Eckhart Tolle brought forth was the idea of embodiment being this energetic felt awareness of the field of the body. He called it inner body awareness. And I worked as well with this Colombian Gnostic teacher, only through his writings. He passed away in the 50s, Samuel Ovar. And he talked a lot about this as well. He called it auto reflection. He said, during the day, constantly bring yourself back to your body, to your heart. Bring yourself back to this reflecting on yourself, because you'll notice that if you just observe yourself throughout the day, you're constantly going up into your mind, which is abstracting you from your life, and you're going into the future and the past. You're not being in the present. Now, physiologically, this is a tremendous drain on the body. I mean, I've seen with some of the clients I've worked with and in my own life, how much just sheer energy is brought back into their lives from just having more mastery over the mind, not getting it to monkey around so much. But then on top of that, and this is where things to me are very relevant to what's happening right now on planet Earth, is that when you start to tap into presence, you are tapping into this like greater sense of consciousness. They talk about the biggest field of energy is the heart in the human body. Now, our scientific instruments can only measure to about 10 feet, but like the Heart Math Institute, they hypothesize that could be 20, that could be 50 feet. We can't get that subtle yet, but it's like thousands of times greater than the brain. So that in itself is already like a qualitative phenomena that we can see that's pointing to this truth that this consciousness, this intelligence is greater. And we don't really live from that place. And I think it's very common for people when they start meditating, start contemplating more and reflecting, which I see as kind of meditative thinking, they start to find more intelligence coming online in their life. They start to become wiser because this intuitive wisdom starts to show up more. And it's a practice because at the beginning, you don't really notice it even, or you may be, because some of the intuitions can be really daring. I wrote a poem about this, how, you'll walk by a police officer and your heart will be like, hug that person right now. You're like, God, no. God, no. And that's where spirituality can get a little kooky. And that's why you have all these like crazy, wild stories of yogis, right? Because when you start to listen to what the heart is saying, which is really what Jesus was saying, which is all we need to do is really love each other. But then what does that actually mean practically? It can be really radical. And that's where I think, the next stage would be, you find yourself practices to tap into that wellspring of endless wisdom, which is salvation. Like, it's not this Messiah, like, and that's why, one thing, and I have a lot of problems with religion, but this idea of Christ consciousness, I resonate with that in one dimension, because it is saying, consciousness is coming through us. That's great, because then it's more about, seeing ourselves as the seed of truth. But then the next step, and this is why, I've enjoyed some of my life in Costa Rica, because when you then enter back into civil society with this transformation happening, you're very kind of tender and innocent. And it's hard to get that positive reinforcement, especially nowadays, because it's all been weaponized against this evolution. So you'll turn on the news and be like, oh, did you know meditating can lead you into becoming a QAnoner? And you're like, oh God, shit, better stop meditating, but this is where, you start to see the mind control has had to become super weaponized, because it's just, there's too many of us. So they have to get like really manipulative. And it's just actually making it worse for them, because people are just seeing it like, well, that's a little absurd. Oh, these spiritual people, they're all secretly hippie Nazis, all this stuff. Like, I mean, it just gets to the point where it's so absurd. So the next step would be, how do we create communities where we can live this kind of new form of being together, and then figure out, well, where is that going to, how does that create practicality? Because we were speaking beforehand about communities, and I'm sure the same things you guys saw in Mexico. And I mean, God bless people for trying to do this, but there's a lot of young people who have money, maybe they're crypto millionaires, they're buying land, and they're like, that's all we need to do, buy the land, then take some mushrooms and it'll happen. And it's like, well, no, like, who's gonna take out the poop from the compost toilet? And so it's like, it does become more of like, I think, the need for like ashram settings almost.
Well, it's interesting, because it is very much like, I like that analogy around hugging the police officer, because it's like, I find like when you start to first connect to this other group of information, because it is, and how we've talked to other guests like RJ Spina, and it's like, and Guy Needler, and some of these people that talk about it from a frequency standpoint. When we are in the lower frequencies, we basically operate by logic and linearity. That's the tool for that specific density on the planet when we're there.
Known through the five senses.
Everything that's just known through the five senses. When you start to move up into these different concepts of frequency, which I would say correspond with different states of consciousness, then we're privy to different information. We access in a different way. It's more multidimensional. It's more intuitive.
It's kind of like changing your radio station. So if the analogy that's been used is, if you're used to just hearing 96.3, and that's what the radio station that you listen to all the time, and then all of a sudden one day by chance you kind of come upon 107.9, it's like, whoa, it's a whole different world and reality and information that becomes available to you.
But what I feel like where we are then right now is that when that information comes available, and that information isn't necessarily the norm in the way that the current culture and society runs, it's where there's this you start to wonder, like, is something going wrong? You're trying to figure out, how do I implement that in a very practical, real way without kind of going off somewhere, and not, which isn't really helpful to yourself or other people. Sometimes you're trying to figure out, how do you integrate it, right? And I think the same thing when we've seen some of the different, quote unquote conscious communities. I think that's the concept they're trying to figure out, but it gets so
It's
all
not
over the
coming,
place.
it's not coming from the heart. It's coming from that same initial ego, small self, knowing reality through the five senses, through the logic, linear thinking. So it's almost impossible to make that shift if you're coming from that place that only knows reality in a very limited way.
Hmm.
It
But
gets
then,
lazy, spirituality can get really lazy. And I think we are also like social media has done a number on a lot of us because it's like Vanity Fair, right? And I was even remarking this morning when I woke up and was on Instagram, and now it's just like everyone, we're all like selling things on Instagram, selling this, selling that. Everyone's a coach, blah 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 blah. And you get a little frustrated. You're like, God, I miss the days when there was just like artful photos and poetry or whatever. And I kind of like had this moment where I was like, God, I just hope we can get beyond capitalism because it's really doing a disservice to our spiritual growth, because it needs to have a much wider place of expression. And now people are just like, the minute they get an insight, they're like, I got to monetize that into a product. And that just limits its scope. And again, don't want to throw baby out with the bathwater. It's like I think it's great that spirituality has reached such a mainstream space that actually it's become a marketplace. In a sense, there's something beautiful with that, and it can accelerate certain aspects of it. But there is a lot of ego, and I think there's this beautiful writer, Robert Moore. He wrote King, War, Magician, Lover with Douglas Gillette, and he's a Jungian psychologist. But he also wrote this amazing book called Facing the Dragon, and it's all about spiritual egotism. And I used to teach workshops in this because I was like, man, we all need the technology of this book, because he basically just calls us all out. And he's like, when you're working with spirituality, especially if you're working with like polytheistic stuff, like mantra chanting and bringing deities in or archetypes. I mean, you see this now a lot all over the place, like people just titling themselves priestess or this or that. And these are huge archetypal energies that you're bringing into your ego. And if you don't have the proper diminishment around you, because you're supposed to bring it on and then take it off. And that's why it's good to have a community that can hold you accountable, that can give you constructive criticism. But a lot of this, like, we're seeing a very lazy, it's like diet spirituality out there in the world.
mm,
Like the real spirituality is like, it's a much more arduous path. It's a much more challenging path. And we need more elders, for instance. I don't see a lot of communities that have the elders. I just see a lot of incredible young enthusiastic energy, but then they run into problems so quickly. And there's also such a reliance on psychedelics nowadays to self-realization. And I'll just say it, I think psychedelics are great. As Aldous Huxley said, they open the doors of perception, but then after you've opened that door, you have to walk through it and then walk with that new insight as a perpetually embodied practice. And that can't be done with psychedelics. That's done in your cold, sober life, in waking up in the morning, dealing with your kids, taking out the garbage. These things don't change.
Mm-hmm.
But what can change is the way you relate your inner world to them. And my experience, and I'll finally share on this, is that the more spiritual I become, which I see as more unified in mind, body, and soul, the more kind I become, because I'm more calm, I'm more thoughtful, I'm more centered. And I see everything, as Samuel Avar would say, is your spiritual gymnasium. Even getting coffee at the coffee shop is an opportunity to connect to the barista and to give them grace and to give them your respect and to honor them. And when you start to really see that, that's what I call as the re-enchantment of the world, because then everything is part of this practice of just being in, the empire of love.
hmm.
What
Wow.
what RJ Spina had said is that once you get to the seventh dimension or seventh frequency,
Mm.
then it's impossible for separation and hate and judgment to be an issue, because you ultimately have a full knowing that what you put on another is actually something that you're putting on yourself.
You
And
fully realize the illusion of separation.
yeah, so it just doesn't happen
Mm.
within that dimension, within that level of frequency,
Mhm.
which is interesting because I feel like what's been going on during this COVID era is that there's been certain terms or ideas that have been taken, and you know, spirituality being one, kindness being another. It's
Mm.
been these these ideas that have been used in not so true and pure ways,
Mhm.
because yes, being kind is important. However, when you're being when you're asked to be kind in the face of something that is absolutely unjust or untrue or manipulative, then what does that look like? And does that mean
Mm.
complying? Does that mean going along with? Does that mean shutting
Mhm.
out what I feel to be true at this moment in time within every fiber of my being, which is what my heart is informing me of, my intuition is informing me of, just to be kind?
Mhm.
Or is there a place then to say, fuck it, like,
Mhm.
you know, this is not the time to be kind, this is the time to speak up? So I wonder if you can
Yeah.
speak on that a little bit, because I do feel like even that word kind has been hijacked during this period in time. I mean, we see it everywhere in all sorts of signs of be kind. And it's,
Yeah, that's a great point. And I grew up with one of my heroes was Gandhi. And what I loved about Gandhi was that he was this insanely strong spiritual warrior. Like if you read some of his old speeches, he would be like, if you're not ready to die for this, because we're going to march up to those British soldiers without weapons, and we're literally just going to take a hit and then go to the back of the line, to the point where their violence is so emphasized because there's no reaction from our part, that it'll just become so obvious to the rest of the world. And it'll hopefully break those men, because violence needs violence to beget its energy. And if you don't respond with violence and you respond with a kind of indomitable warriorship of love, it's not necessarily like, oh yes, policeman, just hit me. It's this, like when Gandhi would, speak to his oppressors, he would speak to them with respect and assertiveness, because he was almost trying to do an exorcism on them. Because he's like, look, you're wearing all that armor, you've got a gun, you're oppressing a fellow brother, you're clearly possessed by something dark and shadowy. You're in this very low vibration. So I'm going to speak to the part of your soul that is dignified, that is intelligent, that is noble, because I think every human being is like that. And I'm going to attempt to resurrect, to regenerate this. Now, that doesn't happen overnight. Like for India to get independence, it took decades of work. But he was super committed to never falling to that level where he would hate the British. He was always in this very radical love. And in some ways, I think Gandhi is still not properly understood. And I think it would do well for schools and stuff to be teaching us more about what nonviolence really is, because I think a lot of people, I've had a conversation with social activists, and they're like, oh, nonviolence would never work. And well, yeah, because it's actually takes a tremendous spiritual calling to be willing to get killed for something, to be willing to even just take on physical violence. And now ultimately, I don't know if he would broadly work in the sense of like, if someone knocks on your door and you're the man of the house and someone's trying to kill your kids, like obviously there's self-defense where I think can be reasoned with in certain instances. But what I did learn about Gandhi was that there is what he called soul power. And I'll tell you one quick story to show you how this worked, because at the time I was living in China in my mid 20s. I was very on a spiritual discipline path where I wasn't drinking, and I'd go out to bars with my friends. And this one night I remember seeing on the dance floor, this friend of mine was this French Canadian guy who's kind of like a gangster rapper, and he was filled with anger, and he was like yelling at someone on the dance floor. And I'm sitting far away, but I'm looking at this in the distance. And at this point in my spirituality, I kind of felt like, okay, I'm kind of like the spiritual policeman. I'm not drinking. I'm at the bar. I'm making sure everyone's mood's great. I'm trying to be always the peacemaker. I'm like, I got to do something. And Gandhi comes to mind. And Gandhi said, if you're going to confront someone's violence, you have to be willing to take a hit. Because if you're going to take on that angry dragon, they might all of a sudden project it onto you. So I had to check in. I'm like, yeah, I'm willing to take the hit. So I walk up and I put my hand on Dave, and Dave turns to me and he starts pointing to my friend George and Lena in the crowd. They were dancing, and he was on the side of the dance floor. He starts calling George, who's black, the N word. He's like, that is dancing with Lena, who I like. And no one knew he secretly liked Lena. Guess what? And he's like angry and he's in his gangster. And I'm like, okay, just let him release the anger, because I know that, but anger is like a very, it takes a lot of energy to be angry. And then I notice like he's vented and he just like sighs. And I'm like, okay, now's my moment. And I come back at him with even more anger. But I'm angry that something's possessed his soul. And I'm speaking to him very clearly, penetrating his eyes. And I'm speaking about how good he is and how he should not let these ill behaviors sully him. And Gandhi would say that you should be angrier at the oppressor for what they're doing to their own dignity, to be stooping down to this level, than whatever anger they have towards whoever they're oppressing. And immediately Dave is like taken aback. He has a few friends around him who all turn and start trying to break us up because they think we're in a fight. And I look at them all in the eye and I say, don't worry, I've got this. And they can see, whoa, he's like super lucid and clear. Okay. And then Dave comes back with the second wave of his anger, but it's softer. So I notice right away, I've won. I just have to let him vent again. And he vents out, oh, well, George, blah, blah, blah. And then I just wait. And then another sigh happens. And I notice he's wearing a Buddhist necklace. And I grab the necklace and I tell him, this is who you really are. You're into Buddhism, this beautiful religion. Like, if you're not going to live up to this, I should tear this off your neck right now, kind of thing. And then he finally looks at me and he says, like, okay. And he puts his head down. I say, let's get out. And I take him out of the bar. And we go outside and he's just like, oh my God, thank you so much. I don't know what. It was like literally like an exorcism. Like this darkness was gone. And I remember his friends like came around. And they're like, what was that, man? That was like Neo in the Matrix. Can you teach that? And it was just this amazing, example in a very small, moment, that there is this kind of power that can happen. I mean, Helena Blavatsky used to call it, the dominating goodness of the soul. That just wants to do such good in the world. I don't know. It's very radical, right? Like, I've thought about, wouldn't it be amazing if people just disrupted Justin Trudeau at some point with like a giant cake and been like, bro, we love you. Can you come and like hang out with us for a weekend and let's just like have an intervention? Because you've gotten sociopathic and we're concerned. You're our brother. I mean, it sounds funny, but I'm like, man, there should be spiritual SWAT teams, where it's like, because I do feel in the right way with the right kind of like energy. And that's kind of what my IG story was saying today, in all funny, sense of humor, the Illuminati. But it's true. I think, a lot of them are like, they must be stressed out, and it's just when they look at the culture that we're all building, which is basically love and trust and hard, beautiful, sacred work. I'm sure it's attractive to them. I've been told that some of the Rothschild family have actually run away to Costa Rica to join the hippies, basically. So seriously, I ran into a guy. So
spiritual SWAT team.
I like that.
Yeah.
Spiritual SWAT teams. What we used to do I'm just thinking about that dynamic you had with your friend, because I mean, a few things come to mind around that. It's like, first, it's like this idea that love can have very much a ferocity behind it. Mm-hmm. I think that's important, because that's something that I think sometimes gets missed. We've kind of boxed up what we think the picture of love is supposed to be, and love is huge. Love encompasses so much, and there's so many different nuances of how that can express itself. So I think there's a ferocity in love, but you never lost sight of the lovingness. It's like you saw the divine in him, and you weren't going to let him out of it until he fought back, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where the healing ultimately comes. It almost makes me makes me welled up when I think about it, because I remember Dr. Hawkins would say you would often heal. He says you would heal people by just seeing the divinity in them until it was reflected back in themselves, and then they saw. So I think that's that's ultimately, I think, a very powerful place of being able to sit in that powerful place of love. the other thing that was really neat was that we used to do these workshops with kids, and it was very much tied with music. And what we'd find is that if kids were very hyperactive, right, if they were like go 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 and super psyched and everything, and you're trying to then calm it down, you wouldn't start by playing very calming mellow music. You'd start by
Mm.
playing music that resonated more with where they were at, and
Mm.
then through that process, you would gradually transition the music so that they kind of came with it naturally. If it was out, if you were, it's like if you went to him, your friend, and he was in this ferociously angry place, and you're
Right.
kind of like, oh, brother, come
Let me
on,
hug you.
let me
Yeah.
hug you. Like, it's so out of
Exactly.
resonance, it's not going to fit.
Yeah.
But you
Great point.
matched him where he was. And then through that
Right.
concept of resonance and frequency and vibration, it's like
Ah,
you helped him, he resonated to you, and then you sort of just you
yeah.
guided him down.
That's
um
a great point. Never
I
thought of
feel
it
like
that way.
that's the kind of thing that I think those two lessons, man, it's like,
Mhm.
how do you kind of stay in that place? I mean, we're reading Paul Selig's new book because we're interviewing him for this
Next week.
series too, I think next week. I mean, it is
Mm.
brilliant.
It's
It's
powerful.
really, well, I shouldn't say brilliant, it's so powerful. We got the first 7 pages and we're just like, whoa, this is, I mean, he's showing like exactly where things are
Mm.
at and what's going on.
The book is called Resurrection.
Yeah. and and one of the things that he was talking about was
Mm.
basically all suffering
Wow.
comes from the lack of
Connection.
connection to the divine. Not that they're wherever not connected, but it's in this illusion of separation from it.
Yeah.
And that if we can start the practice again, I think of seeing the divine in all things. So we've been doing this with our kids in the morning. We wake up and we just, can we see divinity in everything? And it's easy to see it in nature. It's a lot harder to see it in the things that rub us the wrong way. And so
Mm.
that's part of what we're practicing too, is every time something like that comes up, can we see it again? Can we see it
Mm.
again? Where can we
Mhm.
see it?
Mhm.
But what's
Mhm.
beautiful about it is that it's planting so many beautiful seeds because I'll give an example. So there's a particular house that we routinely drive by in order to get from our place into town if we need to go into town for anything. And this house is really interesting. It has all sorts of pictures and paintings and statues and buses
Mm.
that this whoever lives there, or how many, I don't know who, or one person, a family, or whoever lives there has created it to be very scary looking. Like it looks like you're driving by a house that's ready for Halloween
Mm.
throughout the year, and it's like this all the time. And I know the first couple of times I noticed this house in passing, like it's right off the highway, so it's hard to miss. I was fear came over me,
Mm.
and right away there was judgment on my part, and it was like, oh my gosh, like how can this person be in our community? What kind of vibe and energy are they radiating out? I don't want my
Mm.
children to see this. I don't want this to affect them. I need to focus sending them light and love, but from a place of absolute fear and a lot of judgment.
Mm.
And reading and being immersed into the content as we have been for the past while of Guy Stephen Needler and R.J. Spina and Paul Selig's book now, really profound stuff, because it plays on it it works in ways that we might not even be fully conscious of, where you're reading something and you think, okay, well, this is interesting, but it actually plays within your life. One day when we were driving past this house, the same house, Jay was driving and I was just quiet and watching it, and I noticed that what came over me, um, seeing his sign that reads like hell is full, and this
Mm.
red sort of
Wow.
figure with arms reaching up to the sky, like really strange sort of um,
Mm.
signs around this area as well. What came over me was, you know, this person or these group of people who live at this address, they have stepped so far away, they have separated themselves so far away from source,
Mm.
from and source, the qualities of source are love, joy, wisdom, true power. And so they have stepped so far away from knowing their own inheritance so fully that this has happened. So what filled me up so completely was love and compassion for them. And what Paul Selig said was that it's actually that energy that when you allow that energy to come forth, when you see God or divine or however which way, I know the word God has even been so politicized that even when we say it a lot, oftentimes so many of us have certain stigmas around it. But whatever you believe, what you know to be absolute love, unconditional love. So when I was able to connect with that place within me and have enough space within my being to allow another within that, I feel like that kind of energy is what we're being called to step into more and more these days. And I feel like even with Paul Selig's book, Resurrection, and what you're speaking of, and as far as the music frequencies that you're imbuing with love and understanding and compassion, that's the result in how it's actually literally playing out in practical terms within our everyday life.
100%. And that's very radical and powerful practice. And, when we look at the stage of our world right now, it almost makes me think, and I'm actually writing a few books right now myself, and one of them is a spiritual novel called Earth Night, and it's sort of a resurgence of the Arthurian legend. So you have Merlin teaching this young boy called Arthur, and it's all about the Gnostic mythology about Sophia and what they call the archons, which are these like negative entities that have been possessing humanity en masse, and some could say our arch nemesis. But I've been very interested in this whole concept of evil from a young age, and in the sense of like, how do we end this polarizing good versus evil thing? And it's interesting that the ancient Gnostics did not believe in good and evil. They believed in sanity and insanity, which is quite a different thing. And I think that's a very profound difference. But I do think there is, when we look at how the mind controlling matrix right now is playing us off of each other, you think about the World Economic Forum, for instance, or our current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and like these people come onto our news feeds, and we're just like, oh, revilement, like F Trudeau, these things, and of course we're kind of groomed to hate them. And I had this kind of funny thought, and Merlin actually teaches this art in the book, where he's like, this whole system of tyranny is actually this entity or this aspect of our humanity that does not want to change. So it's creating this whole matrix of opposition so that it can perpetually hide as our enemy. But the minute we like pull back, like in the end of the Wizard of Oz, when we find behind this huge tyrannical empire, there's this little man with a broken heart. That's universally what we're dealing with. We're dealing with parts of ourselves, parts of our species, parts of other species, even, that are kind of broken on a heart level. And so then the idea is, well, how do we heal them? If you're dealing with like a New World Order pedophiliac leader, I mean, that brings probably the most triggering feelings of hate and rancor in us. But then they're part of our human family. Is there a way that we can heal them? Perhaps. Is there a way that we can love them so fiercely that they might be motivated to change those kind of ways that we might see as devilish? That's a very high calling. But I don't, there are other ways out of it, I'm sure, but I think that's one of the ways that we have to start pioneering. And we're like the pioneers of that. It's so new. Gandhi, like I said, his teachings are still, I feel like, undiscovered by a lot of people. And that idea of soul power, I think this is something that we need to spend more time in. It's something I want to spend the rest of my life devoting myself to exploring and embodying, because those little stories that I've shared, those have happened quite a few times, and they've always blown my mind. And everyone around me has been like, what was that force that was being brought to the fore in those situations that most people would never dream, a harmonious resolution would come from. Um, but it's been shown time and time again. Martin Luther King. There's been a lot of big resolving moments actually in our human story that we're not taught about. Because the frequency is always to teach us versus
Mhm.
them, hate, and then to be triggered by. And this is why QAnon. I always had to I followed. I was interested. It's an interesting concept, but there was always a part of me that was like armed resistance because there'd be these big cap messages.
Yeah.
These people are sick, and you could feel this tone of like yuck. We
Mhm.
have to destroy these people, and I was always like, well, what about the tone of like if I was a healer, and it's like these people are sick. Like how do we help them? Like my God, and
Mhm.
that takes a lot of work. That's going to take a lot of work for us to get of our own selfish egos as we're like trying to form communities to actually like detoxify from all the madness that they've created and then try and reach a hand to them. I mean, it seems kind of like unfathomable.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's the way. I'm curious and I'm inquiring about that because part of me thinks, if we were to destroy all these people, uh, have we dealt with it? Because these are literally consciousness. It's not people that we're dealing with. We're dealing with consciousness. How do we heal predatory pedophilia, for example? This is like massive, massive work.
I think that's such an important conversation to
Mhm.
continue because it's new territory, and the way that we've done things in the past is likely going to be different as we move forward. And it's not like you just go from here to here. I remember one of my other teachers, he would talk about, it's like the consciousness of a lion. You don't have to hate the lion because of what the lion does, but at
Mm-hmm.
the same point, you're not going to go crawl in the cage with the lion. Like you're still going to be aware
Right,
of of
right.
the reality of what could happen. So it is this transition. It's like, at a certain state of consciousness, then, it's not even possible to hurt people or to do things at a certain point. But, that's a transition that we're all sort of playing a part in. What's that going to look like, and when what's the in betweens before we eventually arrive there, if we ever do arrive exactly at that,
Within this lifetime.
at least within this lifetime. But I feel like part of it is also you have to look beyond the lifetime and looking. It's like, what do they say? Sometimes you plant the
Exactly.
seeds that you may not be there to enjoy the shade for, right?
Yeah.
Um,
The
I think
indigenous, First Nations talk about, six
seven, yeah.
generations, and when my teacher first told me that, my mind almost snapped because I was like, six generations, like that's like how long? I can't even fathom how long that is. And it just shows you that they're working in this nonlinear space, of just like, hey, we're planting the seeds, things can grow exponentially. We see it in nature. You can have a great growing season, boom. But then, there can be adversities, droughts, things like that. Everything's an opportunity to learn something. But it is about, when you get into that soul plane, when you're really living from that deeper expression, that more ultimate self, it is about trusting that eternity of the species, that eternity of things in general, that we do our best, we contribute, and then we can safely, know that it will continue to evolve. We don't have to be, this is why the Messiah thing is a spiritual ego trip, because it's like we don't have to be the Messiah ourselves. We can trust the community, we can trust the continuity of our species and life in general.
Yeah. I like that you also mentioned around that, even with things with like QAnon and stuff. It's like
Mm-hmm.
I think those are really important pieces for people to always be aware of. It's like, where do you see
Mm-hmm.
the same division show up anywhere? Because it doesn't matter how people are looking at any of the stuff that's gone on the last while, you will see that same energy of blame or separation or division. You'll see it play out everywhere. And so
Mm-hmm.
for me, it's like that's a big compass for me. It's like whenever I feel anything along those lines, I same thing. It's like, okay, there something about that doesn't resonate, and that's it. Then it kind of just pulls me back to kind of observe more and look for the things that do feel more in alignment with at least where I am at the moment. So
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, Darren, as far as I know you dodged my question with regards to media and TV and programming,
Oh, did
but
I?
but that's okay. Maybe we'll tackle that
I'm
with
a bit of an airhead,
no,
us Geminis.
that's all right. We can tackle that one with maybe Sean Stone would be a good person to tackle that with. But I was wondering with regards to, you know, just looking at the topic of the freedom, the illusion of free choice,
Right.
and a return to mastering your own life. From
Yes.
your experience with your insights and how you live your life, what do you think would be the most masterful way in which we can return then to a place of inner authority?
Well, I think a lot of it is like, it just starts with, the simple reactivation of a contemplative life, which means more or less spending time with your soul. I noticed this at a certain point in my 30s. I'm now 43. I looked around at my friends and like there was people in the 30s, playing video games and always watching TV and this stuff. And at a certain point, I just never got gripped by that. I was always reading books and taking courses and doing this and spending time in spiritual retreats and stuff. And I feel that that was just this hunger in me to really master myself, because spirituality is also about, it's all about what is the self? What
Yeah.
is this human self? Because it's a great mystery, right? We're never told these things in our education. And to me, it's going to be a lifelong and lives long journey of understanding what it is. But there are, and this may sound controversial, but I find that spirituality is the only pathway I found to some kind of objective truth about things. Science does not find an objective, common ground of reality. But when I meditate, when I work with the phenomena of my inner body awareness, I know factually that these things work, that I can become more present, kind, intelligent, loving. When I'm meditating, I'm more present and centered in myself, and I'm not reacting, I'm more responding constantly. And you do find there is this cultivation that starts to occur, like gardening. You're almost polishing and refining this beautiful symphony that is the soul. You're tuning it up. If you are on a true soul path, you should be evolving what are called the virtues. And in Chinese medicine, the Taoists called the virtues the marvelous impulses. Such a beautiful saying, the marvelous impulses. And virtues connote to the number one in Chinese numerology because they're said to be part of that undifferentiated source energy that then spread out and then multiplied into the multifarious beings that we all see as this known universe. But the ground of all being, this unified reality that we would call the most divine, maybe, these virtues are an expression of that. And these virtues, they express through the healthy emanations of our organs, the yin organs, in fact, in Chinese medicine. And there's such things as benevolence, friendliness, kindness, trust, love. And, there's various other schools of, I think of the chivalric knights of the Middle Ages, the Knights Templar. They also had codes of virtue, and they saw this as like the one of the great expressions of our essential humanity was to work on being better cultivators for these virtues. And I think anyone who is on a true path of self-development knows that it's like you grow and you reach landmark moments and you're growing, and it's usually a bit of a wave, but hopefully you're always going further up. And when you start to realize that, Samuel Alvar said, the vertical ladder of growth, because most people live their lives in this horizontal, like whatever society tells them, like, okay, get my job, 9 to 5, wife, kids, husband, retire, blah, that's it. And it's just this like, meh. But when you start to evolve on the spiritual journey, all of a sudden you are transforming yourself. You're seeing changes in your habits, in your patterns, because your soul is this force that breaks through. That's this full on power of liberation. When you meditate, the point is you're also having this connection with a part of your awareness, part of yourself that is not tied to anything. It's totally free and it's dancing and it feels blissful because you're like, wow, all these identifications of the ego thing. On a certain level, my soul is totally free of all that. And that feels amazing. So then the idea is, how do you bring more of that soul into your humanness, into your life? And you start to see those changes of freedom starting to take place. And that's mastery. You're starting to realize I have the power to evolve and make myself a more marvelous and excellent being. And that to me is the highest bliss, because then you're like, oh, wow, I can do this. And the dark side of that is like, I can also totally F myself. But the fact that you can also resurrect yourself, to borrow from your friend's book, and in inconstancy, all because you're going to fall too. I always tell people, like, look, we're not, especially this age where we're first starting to turn the dark age to light. We're like Willem Dafoe in Platoon, running the helicopter, we're getting shot, but we just keep going. We keep going because it's such a beautiful time, with all the resources, all the knowledge that we have. There's so many opportunities to get back up and to be inspired to rise back up. And then we just, we keep going, we keep forging ahead, keep forging ahead. And then hopefully by the time that we pass over at the end of our life, we can look back with a smile and say, yeah, I really, I evolved, I transformed, I moved the needle ahead. Even just a little is massive. And that feeling of mastery is, it's such a good feeling to know that you can take responsibility for your life and that you can install changes that will benefit yourself and, your family and your friends. And to me, that's every human being should feel that and taste that. You should be able to feel that you're contributing more and more to this transpersonal, mission of world building, to borrow from the king archetype virtue, because that's what we're here to do as well, is to build this new world.
Mm-hmm. And then on the other side, you look at each other and just go, let's go back and do it again. Come back and do some.
Well, that's the bodhisattva vow, right? In Buddhism, it's like, hey, I'm going right back, because at a certain point, it's like, what is samsara? If you know that there's this pathway, I mean, that is a bodhisattva. It's like, do you want to just fully leave this realm? They're like, actually, no, I'm going to go back and help all my bros and sisters, and that's apparently the highest calling.
Oh, that's beautiful, Darren. Darren, where can people learn more about the work that you're doing? And I mean, you've got a lot going on. You've got a couple of different, and even since I talked to you last time, I think you've even created some different, you've got a Gaia Awakening Institute, and I mean, a couple of other things. So maybe share with the viewers some of the stuff that's going on for you, where people can learn more about what you're doing. I know you got courses going on too, so.
Yeah, so I mean, the Gaia Awakening Institute has been something I've been percolating for about a decade, and we're just starting to soft launch it. It's going to be more officially launched this fall, first as an online school, and then I'm tracking down a physical location for it. But it will also be kind of a gypsy school, and the idea is just bringing forth this new rendition of the mystery school, the spiritual universities, because it's my belief that there's such an awakening happening on the planet now, but it's like everyone's taking the intro class on spirituality. Now what? Now what's the next levels that we go into? And that's what the mystery schools were all about. They had these holistic realms of discipline. They saw like every human being should be physically fit, should be mind fit, should be emotionally fit. So I've been, training in a lot of these things myself. And, I'd like to humbly hope I have a certain level of mastery in some of them. And I just feel like I want to start offering a lot of my things in one place, just for my Gemini mind to be more consolidated. But of course, we're going to have other faculty and hopefully build it to be this profound, thing inspired by things like Esalen and Findhorn in Scotland. I have created already what I see as like the flagship course for Gaia Awakening, which is called Honor All Creation, A New Earth Journey. And this is an online course that people can opt into at any time. It's a passive course, meaning you just buy into it and you have access to the whole realm of it. And it's a mirroring of my double album, Honor All Creation, which I made in Costa Rica during the pandemic, but it actually was given to me on an ayahuasca journey I did with Dr. Gabor Mate back in 2015. Never had the time to devote to it. Thanks pandemic, I had the time and was shacked up with one of my favorite producers in the world in Santa Teresa, Costa Rica. I definitely won a spiritual lottery on that one. But the album is a concept album. It's devoted to regenerating a sense of the goddess in the world, all these great meta themes like sacred sexuality, connecting to animal spirits. And then I decided, wow, the album is so immense and there's so much teachings in all these songs, to then film 22 wisdom teachings for each song. So there's about 250 hours of video footage. And each song is a chapter with 4 sub-chapters with the wisdom teaching, a spiritual practice, the song itself, and then furthering links that cross-pollinate all over the place. So that's out there now. I'm really proud of that. That kind of just takes people into a lot of the ancient mythologies I've been looking into and how that dovetails with this new earth mythology. And then I also run this Kings of the Heart 8-week archetypal container for men that I'll be running probably at the end of the year again. And my source resonance trainings as well, my sound healing academy that I've created. I'm just back in Canada now on this tour, but I'll be in Europe soon. And we're creating a 4-part intro online course for that. But I teach that every year in Costa Rica as a week-long intensive for anyone who wants to become a sound healer, or if someone just wants to deep dive into this realm of sound healing, which is so much about where medicine is going into this vibrational sense of the world. That's another thing I'm passionate about. And I have albums on Spotify, and my first book will be out later this year too. It's called Love's Revolution. It's a collection of writings on sacred sexuality and divine romance, because that's a huge thing. I believe sexuality is actually the most ancient wound. And it's also something that a lot of spirituality has problems with going into, because it's such a like just powerful and potent and difficult thing to master. And then I speak from my own challenges in that department. I think we've all had to go through lots of initiations with sex and romance.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I know sexual energy, I think in general has been really, it's been very pigeonholed into a certain thing, and it's actually like one of the most, it's the power of creation, really.
Good
It's
point. Yeah.
incredibly powerful and transformative. But I think people need to learn more about that too. So that sounds amazing. You needed a good couple of years to be able to put all of that stuff together.
I did.
We'll make sure we got links for all of that stuff so people can connect to it,
Sure.
including like the music on wherever you've got the music, if you got on iTunes or wherever. We'll
Yeah.
make sure there's
All the
links to all that
places.
stuff.
Right.
Amazing, Darren. Thank you so much. That was
Oh,
a
thanks.
really fun chat.
Yeah, that was fun. Thanks so much, Darren.
I so appreciate you guys, what you're doing, and very honored to be on your podcast again. Thank you so much. So much fun, so enlightening.
Wonderful.